Tonight, we begin with a number that Vladimir Putin never wanted his commanders to say out loud, a number that was supposed to remain classified, hidden behind propaganda about Russian victories and Ukrainian collapse. But on December 11th, inside the Kremlin, during a highly choreographed video conference designed to project strength and coordination, that number slipped through. 1,192,350 Russian casualties. Over 119 million Russian soldiers killed or wounded since February 2022. That's not a Ukrainian estimate. That's derived from Russian military communications, court records documenting soldiers declared dead or missing, and independent verification of individual deaths. And what makes this moment so significant is not just the scale of the losses, but what's happening inside the Russian command structure because of them. Russian military commanders are at each other's throats. The unity that Putin demands, the discipline that the Russian military supposedly prides itself on, it's fracturing in real time. And the evidence is everywhere once you know where to look. Milbloggers, those pro-Russian military commentators who have become unofficial chroniclers of the war, are reporting something extraordinary. Russian commanders are publicly blaming each other for catastrophic losses. Units are being sent into assaults without adequate reconnaissance, without proper artillery support, without casualty evacuation plans. And when those units are decimated, the survivors are reporting their commanders to anyone who will listen. Let me give you a specific example that reveals just how bad this has gotten. A Russian Milblogger affiliated with the northern grouping of forces reported on December 8th that Russian forces near Staritsia and Vovchansk in the Kharkiv direction have insufficient supplies. Not ammunition shortages, not equipment problems, insufficient water. Russian soldiers on the front lines don't have enough water. The Milblogger went on to report that the Russian military command has no plans to conduct rotations despite heavy losses, and that specialist personnel from the Russian strategic missile forces, nuclear forces specialists, are being deployed to the front lines as infantry because there aren't enough regular troops left. Think about what that means. Russia is so desperate for manpower that it's taking soldiers trained to operate nuclear missile systems and sending them into assault operations. And according to the Milblogger, inadequate reconnaissance, lack of artillery support, and absent casualty evacuation have led to catastrophic casualties within these units. These aren't professional infantrymen. These are technical specialists being thrown into combat roles they were never trained for. And they're dying in large numbers because their commanders have no other options. But it gets worse. On December 4th, another Milblogger reported that Russian service members from the 1st Motorized Rifle Regiment told him they suffered heavy casualties near Bezalivka due to what he called ineffective command. The service members claimed that their commanders lied to them, telling them they would be holding defensive positions when in reality they were being sent on assault operations. They weren't psychologically prepared. They weren't tactically positioned correctly. And when the assault failed, dozens died because their officers had deceived them about the mission. This is the kind of breakdown that destroys armies from within. When soldiers can't trust their commanders, when orders are based on deception rather than operational necessity, when casualties mount not because of enemy superiority but because of command incompetence, that's when units start refusing orders. That's when desertion rates explode, and that's exactly what we're seeing across multiple sectors of the Russian front line. The clashes aren't just between field commanders and their troops. They're happening at higher levels too. On December 2nd, Putin held a meeting with senior Russian military commanders where they briefed him on battlefield gains. Multiple commanders claimed Russian forces had seized Pokrovsk, Vovchansk, Kupiansk, and Siversk. Ukrainian officials immediately refuted these claims. Ukrainian Commander-in-Chief General Oleksandr Syrsky reported that Ukrainian forces were clearing Russian forces from Kupiansk and blocking Russian infiltration attempts. Ukraine's Joint Forces Task Force stated that Ukrainian forces control most of Kupiansk and that Russian presence is limited to northern districts. A Russian Milblogger even acknowledged that Ukrainian forces remain in northern Pokrovsk, directly contradicting what Russian commanders told Putin. So here's the situation. Russian commanders are telling Putin that they've captured cities they haven't actually captured. They're staging propaganda videos with Russian flags in contested areas to support false claims of advances. They're exaggerating gains to meet political expectations while the reality on the ground tells a completely different story. And this isn't speculation. The Institute for the Study of War has documented this pattern repeatedly, noting that the Russian military command is using ostentatious flag raisings across the front line as part of a cognitive warfare effort to portray Russian battlefield victory as inevitable when the actual situation is far more precarious. The consequences of this dishonesty are devastating. On December 11th and 12th, Ukrainian forces launched a counterattack in Kupiansk, a city that Russian commanders had just told Putin was under Russian control. Ukrainian forces regained most of the city and 3 settlements to its northwest, killing over 1,000 Russian soldiers in the process. The seizure of Kupiansk had been a Russian priority since July 2025. Russian forces committed tens of thousands of troops to that operation, and then, in less than 48 hours, Ukrainian forces took it back. That's not just a tactical setback, that's evidence of systemic failure in Russian command and control. Here's why this matters strategically. Russia has committed approximately 150,000 troops to the Pokrovsk direction alone, according to Ukrainian military sources. That's more soldiers than Russia deployed in the initial invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. And despite this massive concentration of forces, Russian advances are measured in meters per day. The Institute for the Study of War calculated that Russian forces have advanced an average of 50 meters per day in areas like Kharkiv. For context, that's slower than the Somme offensive in World War I, where French and British forces advanced an average of 80 meters per day. The human cost of these glacial advances is staggering. Russia lost approximately 290 soldiers between January 1 and December 9, 250. That's 83 casualties per square kilometer of territory gained. British intelligence analysis indicates that Russia has suffered approximately 382,000 killed or wounded since the start of 2025 alone. The average daily loss rate in November 2025 exceeded previous monthly rates, with some days seeing over 1,700 Russian casualties. At this pace, Russia will surpass 2.2 million total casualties before the end of December. And for what? Russia has gained 0.77% of Ukrainian territory since the start of 2025, less than 1%. That's roughly 469 square kilometers captured over 11 months at a cost of nearly 400,000 casualties. Those numbers don't represent military success. They represent institutional collapse disguised as offensive operations. Russian commanders know this. That's why they're lying to Putin about capturing cities they haven't captured. That's why they're sending soldiers on assaults after telling them they'd be holding defensive positions. That's why specialist nuclear forces personnel are being deployed as infantry, because the Russian military has run out of sustainable options. The clashes between commanders in Moscow aren't just about battlefield tactics, they're about resources, replacements, and reality. Russian milbloggers report that the 13th 6th Motorized Rifle Brigade in the Vovchansk direction has installed cameras around unit perimeters to prevent desertions and is sending captured deserters back on assault operations as punishment. The 2077 Motorized Rifle Regiment, which is replacing elements of the 13th 6th Brigade, is described as understrength and struggling with morale. Commanders are fighting with Moscow over rotation schedules that never materialize, over supplies that never arrive, and over casualty evacuation procedures that don't exist. This is what systemic failure looks like in a modern military, not dramatic battlefield defeats, not sudden collapses, just grinding attrition where commanders can't trust their superiors, soldiers can't trust their commanders, and Moscow can't trust anyone's reporting about what's actually happening on the ground. Putin sits in the Kremlin receiving briefings about captured cities that remain under Ukrainian control, about advances that exist only in propaganda videos, about a Russian military that is supposedly winning when the casualty figures tell the opposite story. Meanwhile, Ukraine is exploiting these fractures. The counterattack in Kupiansk wasn't just opportunistic. It was strategically timed to expose the gap between Russian claims and Russian capabilities. Ukrainian forces waited until Russian commanders had committed to their false narrative about controlling the city, then struck when Russian logistics into Kupiansk were most vulnerable. Ukrainian forces maintained fire control over Russian supply lines, preventing reinforcements from reaching embattled units, and systematically eliminated Russian positions that had been established based on faulty intelligence. The result? Over 1,000 Russian casualties in 48 hours. 3 settlements retaken. A city that Putin thought was secured suddenly back in Ukrainian hands. And Russian commanders scrambling to explain to Moscow how a victory they had just announced turned into a humiliating defeat before the week was over. This is the pattern repeating across multiple sectors. Russian commanders make exaggerated claims to satisfy political demands. Ukrainian intelligence identifies the actual Russian positions. Ukrainian forces strike where Russian defenses are weakest. And Russian units, unprepared because their commanders lied about the situation, suffer catastrophic losses. The Kremlin crisis isn't just about casualties. It's about command, control, and credibility. When your commanders lie to you about battlefield realities, when your soldiers don't trust their officers, when your casualties exceed your gains by orders of magnitude, that's not a military that's winning. That's a military that's breaking. And tonight, the evidence of that breakdown is undeniable. End script.